less than 30% of adults in Africa have a bank account. For a continent where governments are seeking domestic resources to finance much-needed investments in infrastructure, education and healthcare, this implies that there's a significant amount of cash out of reach for public and private investment. So how do we get more Africans into the formal banking system? The topic has been a major talking point at the ongoing African Development Bank annual meeting, and CCTV's Romanyang, who is covering the event, brings us that report from Marrakech in Morocco.
Now, as a Kenyan, there's several things I can take for granted. For example, here we are in the lovely city of Marrakech, 10,000 miles away from Nairobi in Kenya. However, I can still pay all my bills from water to electricity and anything in between through this, my mobile phone.
That is the power of mobile money. 4 out of every 10 Kenyans who use mobile money services don't have a formal bank account. In Sudan, the equivalent number is 9 out of every 10. Now, those millions outside the formal financial system implies that there's money outside the formal financial system which isn't and cannot be leveraged for other projects. Part of the problem is structural.
Poverty reduction has only been reduced to the tune of 2.1%. from 2000 to 2012. The major problem has been exclusion of the majority in the economy. Why? Because 75% of our population are rural-based and are agriculture-based. And agriculture has only been growing at an average of 4.3%. And so, irrespective of good GDP growth rate, it has not impacted on reduction of poverty because agriculture was not strongly networked to the major actors of the economy.
Tanzania isn't alone in this regard. Most of sub-Saharan African economies are heavily reliant on agriculture, which is a significant employer, mostly rural and mostly subsistence. Mobile money transfer systems are very attractive in such environments since they can bring in millions into the formal financial system while circumventing the lack of infrastructure needed to have access to banks like roads and decent electricity. That said, though, the spread of mobile money has unintended consequences too.
This is obviously linked to the piracy. Some of the monies were actually then transferred not necessarily through into Kenya. Obviously through the local communities that then sent by little SMS messages a lot of that money through the phone to Nairobi to actually purchase real estate. And okay, sure, it's money that was paid, that was obviously not well earned. It's obviously created some inflation in the housing market in Nairobi. But the one good thing about it, that could have happened anyway. But at least the money's traced, the transactions are there, and we know how the money's been used.
Events like these make regulators wary, and the usual response is to prevent the spread of such systems and products instead of letting them grow and then regulating them after the fact. But with millions of people outside the formal financial system, can African states afford not to innovate?
And what we're saying that we need to innovate. We need to make sure that there is competition. If you want to promote competition and innovation, you can't regulate stringently at the same time. You need to let innovation happen. And then you see how you can manage that. And to me, that's the role of the regulator, but not just regulating before everything happens.
Even within formal banking systems, however, there is room for innovation.
One of the problems, the stumbling block today, is to try to finance what we call SMEs and micro organizations. And the biggest problem is that it's very difficult for them to come with collaterals. And one of the reasons that conventional banking is not able to do that is that you can go to a small entrepreneur in one of the villages, repairing bicycles and things, and then you can't really fund them because they don't have any collateral to give you to secure your loan. Whereas in the context of the Islamic banking, what happens then, the Islamic bank becomes part of your business, which means you need $1,000. I'm prepared to put in $1,000, but I become a partner to your business. Yeah, yes. So when I come in, I just come and I monitor the whole process as well. So together with you, I make sure that the business flourishes and it yields revenues.
This proposal addresses another problem, that of access to credit. Across sub-Saharan Africa, 83% to 94% of small and medium-sized enterprises have formal bank accounts. Those are levels comparable to global averages, but just 22% of African SMEs have a loan or line of credit, and that's much lower than the global average and almost half of the average level of other developing economies. Solving the financial inclusion puzzle has several potential solutions, ranging from asking banks to work like venture capital firms, as in the Islamic banking model, to expanding access to mobile money. It's up to each country, several of which are represented here, to figure out what works best for each one of them. Ramanyang, CCTV, Marrakech, Morocco.
So let's discuss that further. Ramanyang is live from Marrakech. Rama, today was day 4 of the FDB conference. What were the highlights of today's deliberations?
Well, the key issues, of course, that emerged immediately after the deliberations that you just saw in that package focused on how to tweak, especially the regulatory side of things, to adopt mobile money and get that flowing into the system as soon as possible. There's also a different issue that emerged in the course of the discussions concerning the behavioral aspects, the cultural aspects that perhaps encourage the spread of mobile money systems. Because you will recall, of course, you've got very, very high penetration rates and use of systems like M-Pesa in Kenya, but the equivalent system, say, in Sudan or Tanzania doesn't have quite the exact same rate. So the question that a lot of the planners and policymakers in the room were asking is there perhaps a cultural reason for this? And can that be something we can then work around with respect to getting Islamic mobile money products, rather, out of the lab and into the hands of the market? One of the key issues, of course, that did emerge after the deliberations was a question of Islamic banking. Now, for a lot of people on the continent, when they hear Islamic banking, they think, well, since I'm not part of that religion, it doesn't really apply to me. So there's a bit of a brand issue that emerged in the discussions there. Perhaps one particular analyst suggested that in this particular instance, you perhaps don't have to call it Islamic banking when you're taking the product to market, brand it differently, call it a different name, and that perhaps will remove the hesitance that some individuals may have to that particular process. However, there are also quite a few issues that did emerge. The funding gap, for example, for SMEs across the entire continent. Remember, these are the biggest employers across African economies, is enormous. $70 to $90 billion, according to the estimates we received from the African Development Bank, in sub-Saharan Africa alone. In order to actually meet that gap by market solutions alone, you need to increase lending levels by at least 270% from the levels in 2012. And that is a very, very big ask.
And speaking of funding, Rama, there's been talk about the design of a new Africa Infrastructure Fund. Are there any new details that have emerged about this?
Well, not much. Donald Kaberuka, the African Development Bank chief, spoke about it in his speech earlier today. The basic idea has evolved from the concept he first pitched sometime in the second half of 2012. Nairobi, where essentially proposed a basic idea where some central banks in Africa who are members of the African Development Bank pool a certain portion of their reserves which they invest across in the West, and then they use that as seed capital to then leverage more funding into infrastructure projects across the African continent that will derive a significant amount of revenue. One of the key things that he mentioned was that this infrastructure fund would not invest in anything that is not commercially viable, that doesn't have a commercial return. But the basic structure really hasn't changed from what we saw last year in August. Right now, though, the key element of it, however, is the fact that it's now being taken to the approval stage by the governors of the African Development Bank. Approval, if it does come, will come sometime later tomorrow.
All right, Rama, thanks very much for those details. CCTV's Ramanyang live in Marrakech. Now, the China-Africa Investment Forum has begun in Beijing, with the focus being trade and investment between China and Africa. Officials at the forum say that cooperation between China and Africa is stronger than ever before, and that China plans to beef up investment in the continent as more Chinese companies consider moving abroad. CCTV's Sisi reports.
Applause for the bright future in China-Africa relations. President of the China Society for World Trade Organization Studies and former Vice Minister of Commerce, Sun Zhengyu, has offered his congratulations on the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Organization of African Unity. He said China welcomes and supports Africa's efforts for future cooperation.
Africa is now an emerging destination for foreign investment. Chinese investment in Africa has reached $20 billion, and China plans to increase that figure. Sino-African economic cooperation has been a great boost to Africa's development, as well as that of the global economy.
The event has attracted renowned economists and leaders from Africa. One of the highlights of the forum is the performance of the aviation and tourism industries, which has spearheaded China-Africa trade in services. Officials believe bilateral trade in services will be expanded to other fields like finance, insurance, and legal consulting, which will benefit both sides. The South African ambassador to China says African countries are in the process of diversifying their economies and has expressed his confidence in the future of China-African cooperation.
African countries are also taking serious steps to diversify their economies away from reliance on export of primary commodities and are seeking to increase the size of their manufacturing and service sectors.
Experts say the face-to-face communication will help further mutual understanding and explore opportunities for trade and investment cooperation. China and Africa maintain a good trade momentum in recent years against the backdrop of a slow recovery of the global economy. China is currently Africa's #1 trading partner, and the two are aiming to further expand and deepen their economic relationship, which is a model for the win-win cooperation among developing economies. CCTV, Beijing.
Newly elected Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta now says that the country is keen to strengthen growing economic and political links between Kenya and China. In an exclusive interview with CCTV's Beatrice Marshall, the Kenyan president lauded existing relations between the two countries and said that Kenya was also looking for business opportunities from its eastern partner.
I think, and as I stated even in my inaugural speech, we will continue to trade with our traditional trading partners, but Kenya will indeed continue to focus on expanding trading partners going forward, and definitely the East is a new growing market, and this is an area that we will continue to focus on and to see how we can strengthen our trading ties, our political links. We also believe that we have the capacity to get technology that is much more appropriate to our needs by looking at some of our new partners. We want to expand our horizon. We don't want to be limited just to our traditional partners. Not that we will delink ourselves, but we really believe that there is great potential to grow our capacity by looking at alternative markets, China definitely being key amongst them.
What do you see, though, as your relations with China in particular and the BRICS grouping?
I believe our relations are very good. Year on year, the trade between our two nations is growing. We also want and wish to attract Chinese investment, to see Kenya as a base where they can set up their manufacturing centers and to take advantage of expanding markets within the region. We're also hoping to increase our own trade with China with regard selling our own agricultural products and so that we can reduce the current trade deficit that we have between our two nations. And I believe, again, there is huge potential, especially in agriculture, to boost our trade with China.
During the run-up, though, to Kenya's election, Kenya's traditional partners had taken a position regarding your election. On what platform will your government be engaging with the international community moving forward?
My government intends to engage with all partners on the basis of mutual respect and reciprocity, understanding that each nation is sovereign, understanding that we live in a community of nations that need to respect one another, regardless of the size of those nations, and the understanding that the way to develop international relations must be on the basis of mutual respect and reciprocity. We need to be able to understand that the age or the era of dictating to small nations or trying to force down specific agendas are gone. We must be able to work together for the mutual benefit of our respective nations, and that will indeed form the basis of our own foreign relations going forward.
And as Kenya tries or seeks to woo Chinese investors, let's look at the economic woes facing South Africa. The country's President Jacob Zuma summoned the media to an urgent briefing in the South African capital Pretoria on Thursday to discuss investor fears, the country's poor growth and difficulties in the mining sector. President Zuma said South Africa needed a stable mining sector in order to increase its economic growth. The media conference came as the South African currency, the rand, dropped to its lowest level in the last 4 years, 10 rands to the US dollar.
An urgent presidential briefing at South Africa's seat of executive power, the Union Buildings. A special briefing with a special focus on growing the South African economy and stabilizing the embattled mining sector. President Jacob Zuma said South Africa's gross domestic product growth rate of 0.9% meant that the country needed to strengthen its economic performance and increase the rate of investment.
Growth in the remaining 3 quarters of the year will have to be much higher for us to achieve the projected annual growth of 2.7%.
He said even though South Africa had been among the first few economies to recover quickly from the global financial crisis, this had not been enough.
Recovery has not been as strong as needed.
The South African president said his country would not succeed in reducing poverty, unemployment and inequality without faster growth. He said he had assigned his deputy president and senior ministers to work with the country's mining companies and trade unions, and the finance minister to allay investor fears.
The Minister of Finance has been using every available opportunity to reassure foreign and domestic investors of our seriousness and commitment to the mining sector and to affirm confidence in South Africa as an investment destination.
He called on South Africans to support government, business and labour to help boost confidence in their young democracy. By late on Thursday, the rand had not reacted to President Zuma's speech. And some analysts describe his speech as a symbolic gesture, which they say had come as too little, too late. Renee Dalkam, CCTV, Pretoria.
Well, did it come too little, too late? Let's discuss this further with CCTV Sumitra Naidu. She's live in Johannesburg. Sumitra, so no new policies, no new actions to boost the economy announced by President Zuma. So really, what was the purpose of this hurriedly convened press conference?
Well, Panina, this is what many are asking themselves tonight. What exactly was this all about? And it's actually raised more concern considering that, we know President Jacob Zuma's approach. He hasn't actually said anything before, and suddenly he's broken that routine and come out and made an announcement about the economy. He's come out to reassure investors, and many are asking themselves, why now? And just as Renee was saying in that previous insert, it's come a little bit too late. Many are saying, why didn't the president come out last year when the mining violence that we saw, the devastating violence that we saw on the mines where so many people were killed? Why didn't he come out then and reassure investors? Why is he coming out now? So, it's really, we're seeing it in the numbers today, a real lack of confidence in this leadership at this point. And yes, maybe a little bit too late for President Jacob Zuma to come out and assure investors.
Pertinent questions there indeed, Sumitra. I'm going to put you on hold for just a minute. We'll be coming back to you shortly. But let's talk a little bit about that speech by President Zuma. It was meant to reassure the economy, but it appears to have done little, going by some of the reactions. Take a look.
I think essentially this was all sparked by the weaker than anticipated GDP number, because anything below 1% and suddenly people start asking questions about economic policy. And as much as we can say in South Africa we have an undereducated population, they're by no means ignorant.
In the next 17 years, between now and then 2030, we need to get something like 6.5% to 7% economic growth compounded every year to make the kind of tripling of the economy, which is what he talked about in the State of the Nation address back in February, become a reality.
Right, let's go back to Sumitra, still live in Johannesburg. It's been a torrid week of economic news for South Africa, talking about the strikes that have hit the mining sector, the plummeting rand, the stagnating economy. What was the market's reaction to that press conference by Jacob Zuma?
Well, that's right, Panina, and I don't think it's only been a torrid week. It's been a torrid couple of months with all the economic data that we're seeing, none of them pointing in the positive direction. But just taking a look at this week, we had first quarter GDP growth numbers coming out worse than expected. Expectation was for 1.9% for the first 3 months of this year. We came in at 0.9%. It was a figure that was far from economists' minds, and of course really raises the concern as to what is happening in this country. That coupled with the inflation numbers, we've got higher inflation, we've got high unemployment numbers, we're almost at 26%. It's really not looking good, and of course we have a very weak rand at the moment. So I think people were really looking for some sort of plan to come through from government, and when President Jacob Zuma spoke today, we didn't really see that. He said that government was doubling their efforts in terms of actions to be taken to address the situation, to address the mining situation in this country. Mining really important, but we didn't hear much detail as to what exactly is going to happen. What are these plans about? What are these doubling of these efforts? Where's the detail in it? So we really didn't see any of that coming through today.
And speaking about mining, Sumitra, wage talks should begin in earnest next month. Are there any latest developments that could perhaps bring relief to the market?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Could you please repeat that?
Just talking about the wage talks, Sumitra, that should begin next month, and just wondering really if there have been any recent developments that perhaps could bring relief to the market.
Well, this is it. The wage talks, haven't even started. They, set to begin, and we're already seeing some strike action on the mines, and we're seeing proposed strike action coming up in the next couple of months. People are, unions are putting forward their demands early and are saying that if these demands are not going to be met, we are going to propose some strike action. So, you are seeing we're seeing more of this coming through and very little resolve to sort it out. We're not really seeing any commitment from both sides, from the unions, from companies, to actually resolve these issues. It looks like a stalemate before the negotiations can even start.
Oh, Sumitra, thanks very much for joining us. That's CCTV Sumitra Naidu, live in Johannesburg. Now, a new report by a multi-agency team led by the World Bank shows that about 1.2 billion people around the world do not have access to electricity. 2.8 billion have to rely on wood or other biomass to cook and heat, while renewable energy accounts for some 18% of the global energy mix. The reports found only modest progress since 1990 on expanding access to electricity and clean household fuels, increasing the share of renewable energy and improving energy efficiency. 20 countries in Asia and Africa account for about 2/3 of those without access to electricity. 3/4 of these use solid fuels, wood, charcoal, animal and crop waste, and coal to cook or heat in their homes. The report is the first of a series to monitor progress towards objectives of the Sustainable Energy for All initiative, launched in 2011 by United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon.
Access to energy is absolutely fundamental in the struggle against poverty. It's energy that lights the lamp that lets you do your homework. It's energy that maintains the heat in a hospital. It's energy that switches the lights on in a small business where most people work. And so without energy, there is no economic growth, there is no dynamism, and there is no opportunity. And so we will do everything that we can in the World Bank Group between now and 2030 to make sure that everyone has access to energy.
And as we wrap up BizAfrica, let's take a look at how major markets across the continent traded today, beginning of course with the Nigeria All-Share Index, which ended the day in the green with almost 2%, going to the JSE, despite all of the economic chaos being witnessed there, in the green as well, with about 1.5 percentage points, going to the Nairobi Securities Exchange as well in the green by 0.17 points. Rather, and finally the EGX as well in the green with 0.20% at 5,348.97. So let's call it a day here on BizAfrica.